what I work on is called sociophonetics, and I'm going to talk to you about some work I've been doing with a couple other colleagues, and I'm going to talk to you about what we've been working on about sound changes in sort of structural theoretical linguistics, specifically as related to things that are happening in Canada. Basically, in North America, there are 3 sound changes that are happening currently. And they're all moving actually in opposite directions. There's the southern shift, the northern city shift, and the Canadian shift, or some people call it the third dialect shift, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. Theoretically, they've all been said to have this push-pull effect, and I'll show you how this happens. But this is a theory about how they actually operate and what causes them. And when we talk about these sound shifts, what I want you to think about is in your mouth where you make sounds. Linguists think of it almost as a vacuum, and when something moves out of one place, something in theory has to be sucked or pulled into it, and it has to, one sound shoves another sound out of the way, and it creates a hole, and then something else comes in to fill it, and we'll talk about it. There's the third shift that I'm working on for this paper, which is the Canadian shift, and the big thing with it is it just involves just this small set of vowels here. So the southern shift involves a lot of vowels, the northern city shift a few less, and then this just involves a few, and it's the lowering retracting of, we call this the kit, the dress, the trap vowel. And they basically move backwards towards the sounds like lot and palm, like all sounds. And these are the things that when people imitate Canadian English, they'll do a lot of. Most people say once one thing goes in motion, it's inevitable. It's just going to happen because it's a system, right? It's a system. It's just going to happen. It's a chain reaction. And once this train leaves the station, it's done. It's just a matter of time before it reaches completion. And that may take 3 generations, but that it will happen. 3 generations of people to get it all the way done. And a lot of folks now, like myself, are saying, no, actually, you don't have to have all of it. You can just pick and choose a few things because all you need is distinctiveness, and that distinctiveness can just be a little bit of space between one vowel and another. So the question that we asked in this paper was, is this idea too deterministic? Will all communities actually do a change like this Canadian shift in the same way? And are you required to be part of a group of people doing something just because you're in the region covered by it? We looked at 4 communities in Canada. We looked at 2 in Toronto, 1 in industrialized Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and then 1 in Newfoundland. So basically moving across eastern Canada and looking at differing levels of rurality and urbanity. So one of the first communities we looked at was a community called Belleville, Ontario. It's 2 hours out of the GTA. It's got 50,000 people. It's basically does factory work. And they actually have even written evidence that this shift in Canadian English, that moving backwards towards lot of the trap vowel, was happening as early as 1852. They actually have written evidence of it where people were writing things. And basically what happened here was we figured out that there was no difference between age groups or sexes, but that they all had the Canadian shift. It was done, it was completed, and even the 85-year-old had this pattern. Like, there had never been a question that it existed. So this is what they look like when they have it. You can see how far backwards things are moving. It looks just like that chart that I showed you earlier. Then we looked at it in another community called Thunder Bay. It's 18 hours from Toronto. It's like way west. It's similar, I guess, in many ways to what you would just expect in Ontario. Large, semi-urban, everybody's employed for the most part, and has decent jobs. Again, no correlation for age. They've had it forever. Like, there's nobody changing their speech in the middle of it. So you don't see like, oh, look, old people had a traditional dialect. Middle-aged people are starting to become more like the Canadian shift. And look, now young people have all of the Canadian shift. It was like, nope, everybody here has always had the Canadian shift. That's not surprising. We knew that Ontario has always had the Canadian shift. We know it's long-standing. We know we don't expect to see any variation. We just expect them to sound Canadian, bottom line, okay? But we get to Cape Breton. Cape Breton's in Nova Scotia, and it's in a rather isolated area of Nova Scotia. It has a stigmatized cultural heritage. And I want to play something for you. This is an example of what local people think about the traditional dialect there.
I like the bacon and the sandwiches. It just tastes really good. It's kind of got a little bit of like hickory smoke to it. You kind of taste them all. One gigantic cornucopia of awesomeness.
We asked him, like, what are your feelings about the dialect? Like, after we end the interview, we asked these questions, like, what are your feelings about the dialect? And he was like, oh my God, I have to tell you this story of what happened to me. I was in this commercial at one point in my life, and I got death threats. And we were like, death threats about what? And he was like, about my dialect. People hated me. Nobody in Toronto and Ontario is getting death threats about sounding Canadian, because everybody sounds that way. But this guy sounds traditional. Everybody has really, really negative stereotypes about it. So let's imagine what's going to happen. Oh, the dialect's going to fade. And when we started to look at it, we actually realized that no, what's happening here in Cape Breton is that there are a group of people who are maintaining that traditional dialect, no matter how vilified it is, and they are not changing the way they talk. There are some people who are very traditional, and then there are some people who are moving around, right? Some people have a traditional dialect, and some people have a non-traditional dialect, or a greater Toronto area dialect. And so what we're positing here is that there are probably two separate phonologies or two separate sound systems at work there, and people are basically bidialectal, that they can pick what dialect they want to use and they can shift really easily. Then the final piece was looking at Newfoundland that you've heard me talk about before. We looked at it in an urbanizing fishing community. It's only 15 minutes from St. John's, which is the capital, but I mean, like, there's a real caveat. They finally have a road, and that's not a joke. That's for serious. Only 924 people. Their major industries were, at one point, fishing. But when we looked at the young men, and I know this looks crazy, to gloss it, basically what happened was older men did not have anything that looked like what they did in Toronto. Middle-aged men looked like they were in Toronto from their vowels. And then the young men actually reversed it and said, no way in hell we're going to sound like this. And they backtracked and went back to traditional. So if you put young men and old men together, they were and quantified them, just gave numbers, they were virtually indistinguishable from each other. We actually can't say, like, you live in Canada, therefore you're going to get the Canadian shift and it's just going to happen to you and it's the contagion. We actually have to say now that in areas where there are, like in Newfoundland and Cape Breton, where there's social and actual geographic isolation, we have to give it credit. Sound change just isn't something that takes over you and it runs amok. It can't happen that way. People can actually resist sound change, which is completely new. What we're finding is it has to be some sort of external evaluation and external validation that has to happen, or the rejection of mainstream culture. And that we have to actually, as social scientists, in some way grapple with the fact that there are people who don't want to be part of mainstream culture, will not be part of mainstream culture, and it's not because it's trendy or cool, it's because it's not part of their identity and never will be part of their identity. I guess in sum, the takeaway message is sound change happens, we're all becoming more diverse, but we actually do have some autonomy here to some measure depending on where you're from. The people in Toronto don't have autonomy because they don't have a memory of that sound change not being there. It's always been there. You were born there. You don't ever remember anybody that didn't sound this way. The people in Cape Breton have a memory of people sounding both ways, and the people in Newfoundland have a memory of people maybe starting to sound one way, but a lot of local discourse that resists all of it.